Hey guys, Paul Warburg back in Utah today. You guys have been asking for it, so here it finally is. Donald Trump was recently elected as the next president of the United States. So what does that mean for the war in Ukraine, and where does the world go from here? Now, as we engage with this topic, I want to set a few ground rules, because obviously this is a topic that has been very emotional for people on both sides of the political spectrum. And I actually completely understand why people on both sides of the political spectrum would be very emotional and concerned about this issue. Not because I think both opinions are valid, but because I can understand why people would feel the way they feel based on what they've been told. I want this analysis to be a little bit different if possible. I want as much as possible for this analysis to be an objective analysis of the actual facts on the ground and a semi-comprehensive bringing together of information from all parties involved so that we can arrive at what is hopefully the most accurate picture for what is probably going to happen to Ukraine. Final ground rule is that this video is not about whether I personally wanted Donald Trump to become the next president of the United States, or whether or not I personally agree with Donald Trump's stance on Ukraine. This video is about what I think objectively might happen now that he is. And if I put all of my cards on the table, I personally wish that Donald Trump would stand behind Ukraine a lot more explicitly than he has. And I wish that he would take back a lot of statements that he has made about Ukraine because I think they're inaccurate. However, that being said, I also do not believe that Donald Trump's presidency will be as catastrophic for Ukraine as a lot of people have made it seem. This is why. Diving into the analysis, let's start with what Donald Trump has said about Ukraine and with what the consensus right now is that his plan probably is. Donald Trump has obviously made a lot of statements that he will end the war in Ukraine if he is elected. Something that everybody wants, but that people are a little bit skeptical about. Because of course Russia and Ukraine also want the war to end, but they want the war to end on their terms, and that's why they're still fighting. In order to force the war in Ukraine to end, the prevailing theory right now is that Donald Trump will probably go to both parties. He will go to Russia and he will go to Ukraine. And to Russia, he will say, you need to stop fighting against Ukraine because if you don't, I am going to get behind Ukraine in a very big way. And it's going to be catastrophic for your war efforts. And to Ukraine, he will go and say, you need to stop fighting against Russia because if you don't, I will remove all U.S. military support and you will lose the war. That is the setup that we're working with. Now let's talk about the flaws with this setup. Now this plan to end the war hinges on a major assumption. And it turns out that this assumption isn't actually true. That assumption is that the reason Ukraine is able to continue fighting right now is because of United States military aid. And the assumption is also that the United States has the capability and the willingness to ramp up aid to Ukraine if it needs to. However, something interesting happened in the month before the election that completely undermines all of this. And this was a statement made by President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine that I actually think was quite intentional. The month before the US election, Zelensky got in an interview and he clarified to the entire world that of the $61 billion that the United States had allocated to go towards Ukraine in April of this year, only 10% of that aid had actually made it to Ukraine. Now, this is an incredibly interesting statement, because if you read between the lines, what Zelensky is basically clarifying to the world by sharing this information is that Ukraine has been fighting for the past year basically without U.S. aid. U.S. aid obviously could have helped them more, but the U.S. failed already to deliver on what was promised. So Ukraine's ability to continue fighting against Russia doesn't hinge on U.S. aid. And what that shows is that the U.S. actually has no leverage, or at least not nearly as much leverage as they think they have, when it comes to forcing Ukraine to end its war against Russia. They have been fighting this long on their own or via the help of other partners. The U.S. has not contributed in a meaningful way for the past year or so, And so the US backing out isn't going to make a meaningful difference on the battlefield. Now, on the other side, the unfortunate reality behind this statement is also that the US has no leverage over Russia. Because the reason, or at least one of the reasons, that the US has only given 10% of what it promised to give to Ukraine is because the US industrial base is not large enough to deliver on their promises quick enough. And what that means is that even if Trump threatens Putin that he is going to rapidly increase aid to Ukraine, Putin is probably going to read that as a bluff. So in other words, even though Trump campaigned on this promise that he could end the war in Ukraine, unless he has a trick up his sleeve that nobody else has imagined, and we've all been following this war a lot more than Trump has, I guarantee you that, Trump actually has no leverage to create this deal that everyone is so scared of. So with this in mind, let's now analyze the worst case and the best case scenarios for how a Trump presidency will impact Ukraine. And let's start with the worst case scenario. The idea that the United States will completely cease all future aid to Ukraine. Obviously, this is not good for Ukraine. But let's put it in context, which we've already done a little bit. What is the current state of the war in Ukraine with US support? What we've already seen is that US support has been, at best, a drip feed of supplies that is coming too late and not in the quantities that have been promised. But even worse than that, the US is handicapping Ukraine by giving them these supplies with what I and many people observing the war deem to be inappropriate restrictions. When the US provides aid to Ukraine, they are specifically telling Ukraine, aside from a few regions, that they are not allowed to use these weapons to strike Russian military targets in Russian territory. And for all intents and purposes, this means the weapons, while nice to have, don't provide Ukraine with a significant advantage. Because the reason Ukraine needs Western equipment to provide them a tactical advantage is to do precisely those things that they have not been currently allowed to do. This was the case in the Biden presidency, and the reason that all of this has been the case is because President Biden has a very well-cited fear of crossing Putin's red lines and potentially triggering Russian nuclear aggression. We've analyzed that in previous videos. I think that is an unsubstantiated fear, but I guess as the president, that's his prerogative, and I understand that. The point is that in the current state, US aid to Ukraine isn't exactly creating a utopia. And right now, it's only been enough to help prevent Ukraine from losing the war, but it hasn't been enough to help Ukraine win the war. All signs are that this trend, the status quo, probably would have continued through a Harris presidency. Because Harris is probably unlikely to be more aggressive than Joe Biden. She may be as aggressive, but she's unlikely to be more aggressive. So the best that Ukraine could have hoped for from the US, if the Harris-Waltz crew had won, would have been a continuation of the status quo, which has already not helped them win the war, as unfortunate as that is. Another consideration here is that at the beginning of the war, Joe Biden made a massive blunder that has hurt Ukraine really badly, and that has been criticized by his own staff and by people on both sides of the political spectrum, which was that he went in public before reporters and said out loud that the United States would not send troops on the ground to support Ukraine. What this did is it removed something called strategic ambiguity, and it clarified to Putin that no matter how far he pushed things under the Biden administration, the US had steps that it wasn't willing to take. Arguably, this has empowered Putin. More than likely, this is a step that probably would have been assumed to be continued under the Harris administration, unless it was specifically said otherwise. And so one advantage that comes from changing presidential administrations is that at least potentially this strategic ambiguity can be restored. It might be unlikely, exceedingly unlikely, that Trump sends troops to Ukraine, but the option is still there, where Putin has known for a long time that it hasn't been. That was a sidebar. Going back to the core of the argument, the point is, if the worst case scenario happens, and US aid is completely removed from Ukraine, that will be incredibly disappointing, but it will not be catastrophic for Ukraine, because Ukraine has shown resilience without significant US aid already. Now, there's another important consideration here, which is that earlier in the war, when US aid failed to get to Ukraine in time, it created some big problems. For example, when aid was stalled in Congress and Ukraine did not get especially the artillery shells that they needed in time, Ukraine ultimately lost big cities like Avdiivka because of that, because they just didn't have the ammunition to support their soldiers. People are obviously worried that this might happen again if US aid stops, and it might be unstoppable, and Russia will just push through Ukraine instead of just taking one city. However, there is a key difference between now and then that a lot of people haven't considered, which is that since this time, Ukraine has built up a lot of new manufacturing capabilities that they didn't have. They have some new drone production facilities. They have some new artillery production facilities. And so Ukraine, while they still need foreign aid, they aren't as completely dependent on it. And that was always going to be the case. It just was always going to take Ukraine a couple of years to build up this capability. Because even if you start immediately, you can't just build an artillery manufacturing facility overnight. But Ukraine is now reaching this phase of the war where more and more of their capability and more of the cost can be carried by Ukraine itself, and they're now less dependent on aid than they were at the start of the war, which means that losing aid is getting less and less catastrophic to them, which is a point that I haven't heard anybody talking about. So to be clear, I want aid to Ukraine to continue, and I want it to accelerate, and I want it to be ramped up to a level that we have not even seen before. But even if we remove all aid today, I don't think it will be as scary as a lot of people think. And I hope that's a somewhat comforting thought. So now let's pivot to some other scenarios. What is going to happen if Ukraine aid doesn't stop and Trump actually decides to increase aid to Ukraine because the negotiation with Putin fails? Now, this is a scenario that a lot of people don't think is possible because there's a lot of evidence, unfortunately, that Trump kind of likes Putin's position. He kind of likes Putin, and it's a little bit unsettling. But there's something about Trump that we should all also know. Trump doesn't like to lose. And so if Trump goes to Vladimir Putin and he fails in a negotiation with Vladimir Putin, that is going to put Trump in a very interesting place where the outcomes are unpredictable. And Trump may decide that he doesn't want to look stupid. So he is going to actually accelerate aid to Ukraine or allow some other things to happen. I know that might not seem likely, but Trump has actually already flip-flopped his position on Ukraine several times. Leading up to this video, I was doing a lot of research and reading books and articles detailing conversations between Trump and people close to him, between Trump and people like Lindsey Graham. And early on in the war, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, Trump was very critical of the Biden administration, not for providing too much aid to Ukraine, but for not providing enough. Trump was very critical that Biden did not implement the no-fly zone. And obviously these positions have now changed and he's now flip-flopped in the other direction. But Trump does have ammunition going way back that if he finds himself in a corner and embarrassed and wants to pretend like he supported Ukraine all along, he can lean on these positions. I've actually come to believe that this is part of Trump's persona, where Trump literally says everything so that if he needs to change his position, he can fall back on an older statement and say he was just misunderstood, and his audience will uncritically believe that. That is kind of his style, and that is kind of his strategy. And so there is a potential world where if Trump can't end the war in Ukraine the way he thought, and Trump is embarrassed, he actually flip-flops again due to public criticism and decides to support Ukraine more. Maybe unlikely, but not impossible. By the way, there are some things that have been going on around the presidential election that could allow Trump to do this if he wanted to. For example, it has come out that there were explosive devices, incendiary devices in airplanes that were caught in Europe that were intended to cause terrorist attacks in the United States. And these were, of course, planted by Russia. And so it would be very easy to get a lot of media attention around this subject and build up American public opinion against Russia if that's what the Trump administration decided to do. The point is, just because the Republican Party and Trump have a certain position on Ukraine as of today, that doesn't mean there's no level of ambiguity, and that doesn't mean that things can't shift the other direction. So now let's set that discussion aside, and let's talk about something else that this new political situation unlocks for Ukraine. To put it simply, Ukraine needs one of two things from the United States to help them win the war right now. The first and most obvious that would help them the most is if the United States got behind them in a meaningful way and put such decisive action and equipment and everything behind them that they could force a victory. That's obviously the best case scenario for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that unlikely under either administration. But another thing that Ukraine needs, another option that Ukraine needs, is actually the opposite. If the United States were finally to come out and say out loud, we are not supporting Ukraine anymore, this could actually benefit Ukraine in a way because it would give them clarity. And as I said at the beginning of this video, it would unlock some new options for them. As far as giving them clarity, it would make it clear to Ukraine and also to their European partners that they need to start pursuing those avenues and forget about the United States. So they could focus their efforts, and that might actually encourage Europe to get some things done that they've been very hesitant to do. Because European leaders have been kind of hoping America would make a move first so that if something bad happens, they could place the blame on the United States. That's just how politics work, unfortunately. That aside, let's talk about what this clarity would also unlock for Ukraine. A lot of people don't know this, but Ukraine has targets within Russia that they have currently not been willing to strike because they have been fearful that if they struck those targets, the US would remove support from them. These targets are oil export facilities on the Black Sea that Ukraine has proven are well within range of many of their own homegrown, home-developed capabilities like drones to destroy. Up to this point, Ukraine has said, we're not going to destroy these oil export facilities because we know that if we do so, it is going to create ripple effects throughout the global economy. Gas prices are going to go up, and we all know that a US president is never popular if gas prices go up on their watch. It's just how things work. So Ukraine knows that if they attack this target, they're not going to get support. But if Ukraine now knows they're not going to get support, Ukraine can now strike this target. And what this will do is it will remove a lot of the capability that is currently supporting the Russian economy today. And that will accelerate the decline that we're already seeing in Russia. Up to this point, Ukraine has made the gamble that the US aid coming into them is worth more to them than the Russian economy being destroyed faster by these types of moves. But if the calculus changes, they are not without options. Now, Ukraine can use this as both a carrot and a stick with Donald Trump. They can use it as a stick and say, if you back off from us, we're going to do this, and it's not going to look good for you. But they can also use it as a carrot, because as we all know, Trump is not a globalist, he is an isolationist. And Trump wants any excuse he can find to increase domestic manufacturing capabilities and domestic reliance on domestic oil. And so Ukraine can say to Trump, look, if you want to increase reliance on domestic oil, we can take out this target at a time that is convenient for you when you're prepared to have that conversation. But if you remove aid from us, we can hit this target, and unfortunately, it's going to look bad for you when gas prices start to go up. Now, all of this in mind, another concern that people have is that if Trump cuts off aid to Ukraine, that will then empower Putin to escalate things even further. And I just want to say, I just don't think that this is an option on the table. I know Putin would like to do this, but the truth is that if Putin could escalate things further, he already would have. All signs show that the Russian military is operating at not just maximum capacity, but beyond maximum capacity. So they don't have the ability to say, oh, the US is out of the war, we're going to put a lot more resources behind this. It's just, to me, not a possibility to consider. So all of this to say, my main point in this video is that while people in the United States might not understand why Ukraine wants to continue fighting, Ukrainians do understand. And they're not going to back down just because they get a little bit less of the aid that they weren't really getting in the first place. Ukraine is going to continue to stand strong, and they continue to have a chance to defeat Russia, regardless of if the US gets involved. I hope the US doesn't back away from Ukraine, because that would make their suffering less. That would make the victory more sure and more secure. And I actually think that if the US gets behind Ukraine in a major way, it could guarantee a victory. For more on that, check out my video, How the West Can Guarantee a Ukrainian Victory Over Russia. But in either case, this is not a time to panic or be terrified, but a time to look at the options that are left on the table and make the right decisions with what we have left. Thanks for watching, guys. If you disagreed with anything, I totally understand. There were a lot of opinions in this video, so be sure to let me know in the comments, and I hope we can have a civil discussion. See you guys there.